Hi, it's Karen here again, and this is our final video in this set, and we're going to focus today on leading Redzone meetings. That's where we're going today. So I hope you enjoy this and it's useful to you. The objectives of our video today are to cover the various aspects of running a more complex meeting. So we're hoping that by the end of this video, you will have developed a bit more confidence and competence in working in what we've called red zone type situations. We're going to touch briefly on a model of thinking about emotionally challenging work, which is using a neuroscience principle called SCARF. We're only going to touch on it in this video. There is a separate video for those of you who are really interested in the neuroscience behind this, and you can access that video to get deeper into the SCARF model. We're going to break the actual practical parts of this into two sections. Firstly, we're going to focus on the style and importance of how, as a leader, you set up the invitation to joining a complex meeting of this kind. And then in the second part, we're going to explore a structure, a design that can help you work through these complex meetings. As before, all of this work depends on underpinning virtual leadership skills, and everything that we've covered in the workshops is in use more so in a red zone meeting than any other environment. So it's really super important that if you're going to start hosting really complex, potentially emotionally challenging red zone meetings, that you've managed to get on top of some of the core ideas that we've covered through our time together on the programme. And you also need to have made sure that you have watched the Blue Zone meeting video, because we're not going to cover this area at all, and there are certain things in that video that will also be useful to you in the red zone work. So it's worth pausing now and making sure that you've watched the Blue Zone meeting before you go any further with this one. So assuming that you have seen video number 1, working in the blue zone, this is now video number 2, working in the red zone. How to get a design that will produce the right impact for this kind of work. Now, particularly in the red zone, when you think about what it's about, you're dealing with much higher emotional kind of workload and a much more emergent and difficult area to try to get any control over. So if you don't think about design, you're likely to get some really perverse outcomes from your meetings. They either go nowhere at all and they're just exhausting, rambling, inconclusive conversations, or people revert to very safe answers and produce long, what we might call laundry lists of actions, all of which really don't mean anything at all. So if you're sort of finding that that's something that's happening to you, then it could be that you're not designing to really hold people in the work, and that's what we hope this video will help you do. So just a quick reminder that we're dealing with different meetings and different types of facilitation process to deal with different conditions. So when we are working in the increasingly complex problem area, which nearly always carries with it an increasingly high level of emotional workload, then we need to slow down our thinking and increase the need for dialogue. And so everything about our design is about creating shared meaning that comes from slow thinking and good dialogue. When we're in the red zone, we're really dealing with high emotional load from the work, even if we're not dealing with particularly complex problems. So to give you an example, we might have a simple task like reorganizing an org chart, simplifying some team structures. It's simple in the sense that probably the answer is rather straightforward. Somebody with a clever understanding of org design can quickly put together what it looks like on paper. So it's a puzzle in the sense of intellectual complexity, but the impact that it has on people can create high levels of social and emotional workload, because it's changing the way people relate to each other and how they perceive themselves within a group. And that triggers all sorts of emotional and psychological responses. So when we're working in red zone work, it's not always to do with complex problems. It might be just to do with complex emotional implications, even of simple problems. But this red zone work is really dependent on trust and listening, and really focusing on a single item and allowing that theme to work its way through properly, and not jumping around on lots of different agenda items. It requires us to be fully present and to listen very carefully so that we pick up all of those range of cues. You'll remember from workshop 1, we explored different types of listening. When you realize when you were listening for emotional load and emotional content, you actually heard even more about the intellectual and the factual content as well. So we have to really tune in this area. So as I said, even with relatively simple puzzles, you can sometimes have high levels of emotional load. And in particular, that happens when these things called the scarf threats are triggered. And this is the work of David Rock, Dr. David Rock, a rather famous neuroscientist, who in about 2008 published a paper which summarized lots of findings about how the brain works when it's triggered in different ways. And this was the first time that this model called SCARF was articulated. And I'm going to say a bit more about it here, although the full explanation of SCARF is on a separate video. So all we're going to work with here in terms of looking at SCARF is thinking about the very basics and hopefully whetting your appetite to go and look at the main SCARF video. So let's have a think about what the SCARF triggers actually mean very briefly. So status is when something that's going on has triggered us into being self-defensive or not very resourceful or open-minded, because we have a perception that our status in a group is being reduced. It can be as obvious as grade changes or structural changes, meaning that somebody is no longer getting access to a particularly senior person, or if they've had their budgets constrained, or an introduction of a new authorization level, which all signals that your status has dropped. But it can also be as simple as a leader turning round to somebody and saying, let me give you some feedback about that, or let me give you some advice. Those kinds of statements make the other person feel lower status. They are a status reducing gesture. So sometimes we can't help doing these things, but it's worth really understanding, particularly in a change that you're trying to explore, whether there are people in the room whose real or perceived status within the social group is going to be impacted or feel impacted, because that might put them in a position where unconsciously they're not able to bring their best unless you look after them in a certain way. The same is true of certainty. Human beings are constantly looking for predictable patterns because that helps us to use our autopilots and it makes us work less hard. So when we start raising a complex question to which there's no obvious answer, immediately parts of our brains start firing error messages, which are a bit like a paper jam in a printer. Nothing else will go through that printer until you've got rid of that paper jam. And loss of certainty suddenly, and the way it triggers behavior in the brain, is a bit like that paper jam. And there are certain things that you can do that will help people to get that bit of paper out of the printer so that they can think straight. Now, all of these kinds of ideas are true for the other SCARF triggers as well: autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So if this has whet your appetite to find out a bit more about SCARF triggers, and in particular get some tips as to how you can rebuild people's neuro-confidence so that they can do more complex work, then have a look at the other video. So that starts to help us think about the emotional complexity. But of course, in the red zone, we're also dealing potentially with intellectual and technical complexity. So the sorts of things that you might be trying to get your group to look at in the virtual meeting might be very complex in and of themselves. It might be, for example, to try to reconfigure an entire supplier chain, or to change the way that you interact with a customer. And often this has never been done before, so you're seeking out solutions to something where you might have little bits and pieces of previous practice that can help you, but it's never been configured into this whole thing this way before. So let's start by thinking about how you invite people to get into red zone meetings, because the invitation is really super important, because you want people to enter with a kind of mindset that's going to help you get this work right. So if you are the leader and you are the one who is scoping out a piece of work, you're inviting people to join you in a piece of work where neither you nor anybody else in that room could solve the problem on your own. This is a very different type of environment to what we talked about in the blue zone meetings, where most of the things on the agenda are going to be relatively simple puzzles that need to be solved by using the expertise of one person in the group, or it's an informing action that one person is giving information or checking something out with another. In this situation, it's a bit more like you're inviting people to enter the fog together. And in the fog, you can only find your way through it by taking lots of small steps and checking in with each other and developing each other's learning. So in a way, as a leader, when you are crafting an invitation to a red zone meeting, it's more like you are convening a group of citizens with an equal right and an equal responsibility for the work that's coming up. So as a leader, you need to get your mind into the right mindset. If you are feeling like you need to control this, provide solutions, that it's all down to you to make it work, then you're going to enter this with the wrong mindset. At best, you're just going to rescue people from the job of work that you're inviting them to do. And then soon after, you'll probably criticize them for not having stepped up. But actually, not stepping up may have something to do with the way that you have yourself behaved. So when you're thinking about creating the invitation to the work, think about context. You need to really support the right context so that you're helping the group to focus on possibilities and on strengths and on the willingness to be accountable within the group. You need to be prepared to challenge fake work. Now, I'm not going to go back over what we talked about in terms of fake work, because you can always look at that again on the webinar. But there is a big difference between going through the motions and producing routines and formulaic outputs and keeping the group stuck with the wrong kind of questions and doing the real work. As a leader, you need to replace your desire to give advice and replace it with a sort of mutual curiosity. You need to model that you are a learner, not somebody who knows it all, but somebody who's there to learn it all with everybody else. And perhaps the most important thing is that you need to think about how you will give permission for people to disagree with you. To offer real adult dissent or concerns, or to raise unpopular questions or offer unpopular answers. And all of this comes with the ability and skill to ask powerful questions rather than to give powerful solutions. So thinking about all of that together, that starts to help us understand the mindset of the leader going in. And this moves us from a push model of leadership, where we are being directive and advisory, educative and informative, and we're moving more into a pull model where we are trying to spring loose, if you like, the wisdom of the group itself. So when you come to make the invitation to really join the work, there's a few things that you really need to think about. Firstly, get very clear on your own sense of purpose. Name the possibility that you hope the work will create, perhaps in the form of a question. Now, I just want to pause a moment, because that's very different to simply naming the problem that you're trying to solve. If all you do is name the problem you're trying to solve, then the chances are that you might get a more negative reaction from people. Whereas if you can think about what is the possibility that's on the other side of this problem, how can I frame this in a way that invites people to join me in moving towards something together? You need to, in your invitation, to be clear about what accepting your invitation demands of the other person. We're often very afraid to make a demand of the other person, but actually citizenship and accountability doesn't come from having your life made easy. It comes from answering a demand. So if, for example, you want people to join your meeting and you want them to join for the whole time and not dip in and out, then make that clear. If you are really insisting, because the work is going to be tricky, that they apply and adhere to all the rules of the virtual working environment, about being in a separate room, being quiet, having a proper headset, then be clear about that and make those demands and hold people accountable for meeting those demands. At the same time, make your invitation personal. You are inviting people to come and join you in a piece of work that's actually quite tricky. So you want to reach out to them as individuals, as human beings, not just another name on an email distribution list. Now, this is a kind of a strange one, this next point, because we're used to saying to people that there will be something bad that will happen if they don't join the meeting, because we're trying to kind of get them to join. We want to make them join. This is a reverse psychology move that's quite important when you're doing complex work. You kind of say to people, actually, there is no penalty if you don't come. There's only a demand if you do come, but the benefit of coming is that you'll be part of the architects of the future. And then genuinely live up to that. So if people decide not to join you, you don't punish them either overtly or implicitly later. You keep communicating with them, you let them know what's going on. Because often people will start to join later if they start to see something happening. And when you start a really complex new piece of work using the virtual environment, the people you want in the room are the people who really want to experiment with you. So overall, what you're thinking about when you put together an invitation for this kind of work is you're thinking about freedom, and the fact that freedom brings citizenship and accountability. Forcing or compelling people to do things through mandates and controls merely brings up compliance at best, and is more likely to end up with people blaming you for stuff that doesn't quite fit their style. So, having dealt with your invitation and really thought about how you're inviting people to join you in this complex work, I'm now going to introduce you to a structure that helps you to navigate a complex Redzone meeting. So I'm going to summarize this structure, and then we're going to dig a little deeper into the different parts of it. So when we're doing more complex work, one of the things that's really important is that you do proper check-ins and focus exercises. All the things that we've taught you along the way really are coming into play in the Redzone meeting. Remember, if you're working in the Redzone, you have learning and complexity about technical solutions that have never been done before, or you're dealing with high levels of emotional workload. You cannot do those things whilst people have their emails popping up, or they're in a busy office, or they're doing 3 things at once, or they're just not emotionally present and tuned in to listen to each other in a really, really creative way. So you really need to do that. Name the complexity and ask people to join you in managing the meeting by getting rid of all of their distractions. Now, the structure I'm going to work you through now is a diverge-converge structure that you can see on the right here. So we're going to, as the meeting progresses, it gets more and more divergent, which means opening up possibilities. And then as we get towards the end, we start to converge. And the architecture that I'm going to introduce you to that works through that is actually based on the GROW model. Now, many of you will have come across the GROW model already, which is why we use it. The GROW model is one of the most successful coaching models. We think that it was probably first created by a chap called John Whitmore, but there's also some thinking that it might have been Tim Galway in his Inner Game series, or many others that were creating coaching models in the 1980s. It's hard to attribute, but it is one of the most popular coaching models out there in the world, and we use it deliberately in these kinds of meetings precisely because lots of leaders have heard of it, and getting good at it and getting really intuitive with one simple model like the GROW model can help you in so many different ways, and it's perfectly suited to a red zone type meeting. So as we go through this model and this meeting, you would, whilst you're facilitating the meeting, really be paying attention to the threads of conversation that you're hearing and working with. And it's always useful to use visual mechanisms when you're doing this. So I'm not talking about video. Video can be very distracting when you're doing complex work, actually, but things like concept board, other whiteboard and sticky note technology can be very helpful. And you might want to practice and have a play with some of the really new technologies, like using avatars and physical space models. And lastly, as you come out of this type of work, always build in reflective time to help with your learning. It will pay off, but I'll come back to that in a moment. So let's explore the meeting architecture and the style. As I said, we're opening up a divergent process and then holding the group for an elongated period of time in the fog deliberately and only converging right at the end. Now, many corporates, especially engineering and scientific corporates, can sometimes find it difficult to hold open a divergent process because people start to feel like they want to converge. They want to get things pinned down way too soon. So really thinking about how to hold open that divergent process will really help you. So let's talk about how we start a meeting in this format, the divergent opening to the meeting. The first thing, as I mentioned before, is to get ready and engage everyone properly. Before you even get to the G in grow, do a proper process of getting everyone in the room. Make sure people know each other. Make sure they understand the invitation that you've brought them into. Conduct a proper focus exercise and do some check-in activity for social trust building. If you have had a look at the SCARF video that explains some of the SCARF triggers that this kind of work is probably stimulating for people, you'll understand better why checking in is so vital, because actually the check-in process can help calm down some of the negative SCARF triggers that might be going off in people's brains. That allows them to be more resourceful and bring their best selves to the work ahead. Then when you've got everyone really fully present and checked in, we can start to get to work on the goal phase of this particular meeting. And what we're doing when we focus on the goal phase is we're really getting shared meaning together about what this work is all about. So just keep telling yourself, slow down, slow down. Everything might be screaming at you to jump quickly into trying to solve the problem because you think everybody gets it. But there are two major things that you need to agree at the beginning of any Redzone meeting. The first thing is, what is the goal of this particular meeting? It might be that you want to get to the first step of trying something out, or it may be that the only goal of this particular meeting is to understand fully what it is we're dealing with, and to give people some time to reflect on that after the meeting and come back for a different meeting. So getting clear about the goal of this particular intervention right now, this meeting, helps you to be able to manage expectations and get everybody on the same page about what the meeting is for. That sits within a broader goal, which is the ultimate aim of whatever it is this is trying to solve. So, for example, to take some cost out of your supply chain system, or to raise your profile around a particular product. So whatever the goal is of the ultimate opportunity or problem or issue, and it's really important to get your whole group really clear on this. Simply telling them what you think the answer is and then listening and hearing complete silence does not constitute shared understanding. It's useful to use whiteboards and concept board to help people to come back to you, to post up what they think they're hearing, for example. If there are some either complete silence, which would be a warning sign for you, or there's lots of disagreement bubbling up, you may want to pause and put people into small groups to have conversations. So one of the features of a Redzone meeting is the possibility all the time of flipping people into smaller groups. So if you have a large group, and in the virtual space, anything above about 4 or 5, it should be considered a large group. Think about using breakouts. So you can start this process of understanding the goal, maybe set a couple of questions to get people thinking about, break them into small groups, then bring them back and hear from each of the small groups, capture things on the whiteboard, notice where things are starting to come together and you're starting to get a shared sense of understanding as to what you're trying to achieve. Now here we can see a list of questions that are very useful to have in your back pocket as a facilitator when you are in this phase of the work. I'm just going to pause in silence for a minute to give you a chance just to scan these. You won't be able to read all of them, but we're going to make sure that you have these particular question slides in a handout version, because you can then post these up onto your concept board, for example, and have them in front of you and the whole group while you're doing the work. I'm just going to pause for a moment to let you look at them. So, as I said, you'll be able to come back to these questions. They're here just to give you some idea of the kind of things that you as the facilitator leader will be asking the group to do that work, and start to cohere a picture of clarity about what you're trying to solve. And just as before, on the blue zone thing, instead of posting up agenda items, as people come back from small groups, or perhaps as you go, you can, people can post up what it is that they think that they are trying to work with, and you can start to move those post-its and stickers around and start to create clarity. And this kind of process can be used at any time in the whole of the grow mechanism, breaking out, coming back with stickies, those kinds of things, just like you would do in a physical space. Let's imagine that we've now completed this phase of the work and your group has come together around a common sense of your goal, both for this meeting and for the overall project, and you're ready to move on. This takes us into the reality phase. This is where we are most susceptible to skipping this particular part of the process and leaping forward into solutionizing straight away. And I have to iterate, I think, that the reality phase is incredibly important. The quality of your options and solutions will be so much enhanced by spending time working in the reality phase. The core purpose of the reality phase is to really understand the current situation in all its glory and downsides, strengths and weaknesses, facts and feelings, and use that as a base of shared understanding in the complexity before you start to create options. So anything that really helps us to develop a shared understanding of our current position will help us to, when we do jump forward, to do so with much better clarity. So in the reality phase, probably the person you have to manage most in this is yourself. Because if you're anything like me, you'll want to rush on because you think you've got enough agreement to start brainstorming solutions. Don't do it. It always pays off to have a really good exploration. So what we're trying to get at in the reality phase is what you know, what you don't know, what you've tried, what you've not tried, and to really explore how things currently are. And in particular, whether there are particular strengths and weaknesses and ways of working that hold your practice in its current way of working. So, for example, you might think that taking cost out of a supply chain might be relatively straightforward, because you could think, well, what we need to do is consolidate a lot of our supply purchases in the East and shut down some of our supply networks in Europe. That might be an obvious answer that comes to mind quickly. But until you explore the current reality of how you experience all of these different dynamics, it might not fully occur to you that you have real worries about, say, quality, or that the customer has built into the contract that they require you to have a European supplier. So when we start to dig into reality and pull it apart a bit, we start to understand the complexity of how things are connected together. And also we can explore not just how things are in a factual sense, but how they feel, even how it feels starting to talk about changing it. And this gives people an opportunity to start to build trust with each other and to express fears and vulnerabilities. And these things are themselves trust building and will start to calm down some of those scarf triggers about uncertainty and loss of things like autonomy or status. Again, I want to give you just a few moments to look at these list of questions, so I'm going to go silent to give you a chance to do that. So I know you won't have finished that list yet, it's quite a long list, but we'll give you this slide so that you could post it up and hold it on your concept board while you're actually running your meeting. Other things to think about when you're working in the reality phase is you could, for example, experiment with other visual mechanisms for helping people to understand the current reality. We've used things like getting people to draw on a concept board rather than just using words on post-it notes, to actually draw images that represent current reality. You can experiment with things like asking people to describe their current reality. If it was an animal, which animal would it be? And how is that animal different or similar to the kind of animal that would be required in order to meet the goal that you've just talked about? So there's lots of different ways of getting people to feel and understand their reality before they leap into getting onto options and solutions. So let's move into that phase now. As you really feel a sense of everybody getting clear, and you can almost sort of feel the movement towards thinking about solutions and ideas, the time might be right to then move into brainstorming. And there's lots and lots of different mechanisms for brainstorming, and be as creative as you can be to bring in lots of different thoughts and ideas. Again, it can be very helpful to have breakout sessions. If you've got a large group and people are talking over each other and they're not really listening and they're not building on each other's ideas, you could use breakout groups. Get each breakout group to create their own brainstorming board and then come back and present their brainstorming board to the rest of the group. and then you can move post-it notes from individual brainstormed areas of your concept board and bring them together in a central area where you get the same ideas coming together, for example, and make patterns of those ideas. So it's always useful to have your rules of brainstorming visually available on your concept board when you're doing it. And here are the sort of 6 rules that we tend to use to help groups to stay in brainstorming mode. Things like suspending judgment and not critiquing as ideas are being brought up, but to accept everything as if it's the most brilliant idea you've ever seen, and worry about prioritizing and critiquing and voting and sorting later. Being visual, really insisting on great listening and only having one conversation at a time, and just things that build on each other's ideas. So having a little list of things that you think helps quality brainstorming and having that visually available to people can be very helpful. And again, here are some questions that you can have in your back pocket to help you with the options phase. And you'll notice that every time we've given you a list of these things, they've always been questions, not statements. These are questions. And it's because you're in pull mode. So these kinds of catalytic questions really get the group working. You'll notice here also that some of these questions can sometimes be a bit unusual. And again, this is about trying to get lots of different parts of the brain firing. So for example, say when you've exhausted some options and you think and you look at those options and they look very much like your company. They look very much like their options, but they're within the same box as to what you always do. Then having a question like, if your teenage daughter was in the room, what would she suggest that you wouldn't even think of? So having questions that put you in the shoes of unusual people, having unusual perspectives, can break some of those barriers. As can things like, if money was no object, what would we do? If we had to ask no one for permission, what would we do? If your heart was in charge instead of your head, what would it say? These kinds of questions can take people out of their comfort zone and into something a bit more creative. So by now you'll start to create lots of different options, and you need to start converging. We're just about to start the converging process. So the end of the options process is about sorting and prioritizing, noticing, for example, if there's something that is really starting to stand out as an early experiment that you could have a go at and test out some of the ideas that you're thinking about. How could you try something that will start to show you whether you're on the right track early, rather than trying to build a perfect blueprint, which could take 2 years before you start doing anything with? And then you'll, fail big potentially at the end, rather than failing fast and quickly. And that then takes us into the final stage of the process as we start to converge towards actions and next steps. So when we get into the W phase of the GROW model, this is the will. What will we do? What do we have the will to actually act on? So as we're converging, we're really checking for deep understanding, agreeing actions and owners, and making sure that commitment is real and not fake or just going through the motions. And then having done that, and I'll say a bit more about how to do that, obviously, remember to do your learning checkout. And the temptation when you do a checkout is to focus again on the content. Do we like our solution? Have we dealt properly with obstacles? Those kinds of things. But you need to be really disciplined to make sure that, and if the group try to move back into talking about the content, that you gently just say, we've finished with the content for now. What I want to reflect on together is the process and the learning about how we've worked together in this meeting, not the what, but the how. And also to offer each other some appreciations and some positive constructive feedback. Again, if you've watched the scarf video, you'll see that what we're offering here with this process is actually something that reinforces the parts of the brain that then will calm down those scarf triggers. So by offering positive constructive feedback to each other, by appreciating what you've learned along the way, you are boosting those scarf factors and making it more possible for people to stay in that resourceful state. So let's have another little look at the will phase, the convergent part of the meeting process. And it's starting to really move into action. If you've got your whole meeting structure right, you should have increased energy. Although people will be tired, it's not the same thing as having lost energy or commitment. Your focus here is to get a prototype or an experiment up and running early. Remember that if you're in the red zone, there is no perfection to be had. There is no massive blueprint to be worked out. The first steps in the red zone are nearly always to try to get a small prototype up and running where you can test out some of the assumptions that you think you have got agreement about. You're not looking for hostages here. You want to have genuine commitment and participation. So helping people to step forward and say what they can bring to the party is really important. And more important than perfect implementation is keeping a learning, agile mindset going because you're in the red zone. And again, remember to dedicate time at the end of this meeting for learning reflection. And here again are some questions that can help you with this final stage of the meeting. And again, we'll let you have these so that you can use them in whatever way you want. So that's our convergent process that brings our meeting to a close. And it's important to talk a little bit, just as we exit the meeting here, about timing and thinking about how to maintain energy during a meeting like this. Typically, a meeting that's really genuinely a red zone meeting and genuinely working through this process properly will be about probably about 3 or 4 hours in length. Now that's going to sound horrific to most people. So what you need to do is to make sure you build in lots of breaks. So it's not 4 hours of continuous work. It might be something like 2.5 or 3 hours of continuous work with lots of breaks built in so that people can get fresh air, they can take their eyes away from the screen, stretch, move, and things like that. You can break these meetings down into smaller chunks and do the different parts at different times, but overall that will be a lot less efficient because you'll have to keep going backwards to go forwards, to recap to go forwards. But it's worth experimenting with different forms to see what works for you and your people. So we're nearly at the end of our video. and we're also nearly at the end of our process. So when you get to the end of your Redzone meeting, you need to make sure that you support ongoing experimentation. Maybe having things like Monday morning virtual scrums and check-ins to help people to keep on top of what they're doing. It's much better to have a 20-minute scrum meeting virtually once a week than it is to leave people working for 4 weeks with no contact whatsoever and then do another big meeting that most of it is concerned with what hasn't happened and how people have struggled. So you're really using a fail fast, very agile style mentality. So use all the things that you learn from your own agile practice to support ongoing work after the meeting. It doesn't tend to help to have one person typing up minutes or all that kind of stuff, because it gives people the impression that there's one person responsible for things. So keep everything in the open space. So your concept board might be maintained as the place to go to see what's going on, for example. It's like having a whiteboard in your office where you're keeping up to date with things. And you can use the same thing for your Scrum style, keeping things together as you go along and are testing things out. And then when you do have the next formal meeting, when you actually come back together to do another process, which takes you right through the whole, which might be a couple of months later or whatever it is, if it's relating to the same project, then use the same architecture again. Don't flip back into any old meeting. If you're in the red zone and you're still in the red zone with the work you're doing, then continue to use the same architecture. And don't take shortcuts just because you think we've done that once, we don't need to do it again. So when you then start your next meeting, make sure you check in, make sure you focus, make sure you get people in the room, and then recheck your goals. Has anything shifted? Are you still in agreement about what you're trying to achieve? Is there anything that's now that you've learned that changes something about what's on your agreed goals? Then when you move into the reality phase, you can check in with each other about the degree to which you did what you thought you were going to do, and if not, what was it that got in the way that you really need to learn from, because this is part of your reality about whether you're actually doing the work. So you don't kind of checklist whether people did what they said they were going to do in an evaluation sense. You're checklisting it from the point of view of understanding what it tells you about your reality of doing this work and what you've learned. Then that might take you into the next options for brainstorming. What do we do next? How do we leverage what we've learned and move into the next phase? What are we prepared to agree on now? And so on and so forth. So to conclude this video, we really want to land a very particular idea, and that is that the method is the message. If you know that you're dealing with something where you have emotional workload and you really have to understand what's going on in your current reality in order to even start to think about what you might change, then you've got to build that into the design and into your own mindset as a leader, because this is really about learning. And of course, when we really are genuinely changing things, and that change involves potentially changes to levels of certainty and control, then it's going to create some disturbance and upset. So having the courage to name that and ask people to talk about it is much more productive than pretending it's not there and smoothing over it. So the red zone is really all about learning, and so that's why we've used the GROW process, which is a learning coaching structure to facilitate it. The method is the work. So as before, the only way that you will actually get to grips with this is to try it out. So now you've seen the concepts, the thinking, the models, you've got a method and materials to support that method. It means absolutely nothing without acting on it. It's all about experimenting and having a go and knowing that you will not be perfect when you start out. And as you experience it, trying to do it with discipline and commitment several times, keep a track of what you notice about yourself as you're doing it. Are there particular phases of doing this where you feel more vulnerable than at other phases, or you notice your own mindset gets in the way and you need to hold yourself differently to do the work really well? And reflecting together on what works and what doesn't work. These are the sorts of perfect things to bring into action learning groups with each other, to reflect on what you've tried, how it felt, getting other people questioning and coaching you to try to uncover what it is about the way you're doing it that might be leading to it being very successful or not so successful, and how you can change and improve it. So try it out, have a go, and I'm sure that you'll really find some great value from it. So that's it from me. Good luck. I know this is quite a long video. It's nearly an hour in length. I hope you've managed to stick with me throughout and found the techniques and tips helpful. Let us know how you get on. We'd love to hear. For now, bye-bye.